It's loud, it's powerful, and it's absolutely legendary. The Marshall amps, I don't care what you say, but the Marshall amplifiers is the heartbeat of rock and roll. From smoky clubs to massive stadiums, Marshall amps have shaped the sound of generations of guitarists. But where did it all begin? Well, let's crank up the volume one louder and dive into the history of these babies. Okay, so the story starts in the early 1960s in London, England. And Jim Marshall wasn't just a name. He was a drummer and a music shop owner. At his store, he sold instruments and amplifiers to aspiring musicians. Some of his regular customers? A little-known group of guitarists at the time, Pete Townshend, Richie Blackmore, and Eric Clapton. Can you imagine those three walking to your store? But there was a problem. These guitarists weren't satisfied with the amps available at the time, mostly from Fender. They wanted something louder, crunchier, and with more bite. So they went to Jim and said, "Hey, can you build me something better?" In a British accent, of course. So Jim Marshall actually took the challenge seriously. Teaming up with his tech-savvy friend Ken Brand and engineer Dudley Craven, they set out to create an amp that would meet the needs of rock guitarists. In 1962, the first Marshall amplifier was born, the JTM-45. It was heavily inspired by Fender's Bassman amp, but had its own British twist. It used different valves, transformers, and speakers, which gave it a distinct sound, a warmer, crunchier tone with more overdrive when pushed to its limits. The guitarists loved it, and word quickly spread. Suddenly, Marshall wasn't just a music shop. It was a company revolutionizing the sound of rock and roll. As rock got louder, so did the need for bigger amps. Enter Pete Townshend of The Who. God bless him. He wanted an amp that could fill massive venues with sound, so he approached Jim Marshall and asked for something bigger and louder than what they had. Jim absolutely delivered. In 1965, Marshall created the first 100-watt amplifier head paired with a 8x12 cabinet. But the cabinet was too bulky, so they split it into 4x12 cabinets stacked on top of each other. And just like that, the iconic Marshall stack was born. Ta-da! The Marshall stack didn't just change the sound of rock, it changed its look. Seeing those towering amps on stage became a visual symbol of power and rebellion, and it still is. I love you so much. Now, by the late 60s and 70s, these babies were everywhere. Guitar gods like Jimi Hendrix, Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page, Eddie Van Halen all relied on Marshall amps to create their iconic tones. Hendrix in particular pushed Marshalls to their limits, using feedback, distortion to create sounds no one had ever heard before. His live performances with massive Marshall stacks are legendary to this day. I recall this one story where the first time Eric Clapton saw Jimi Hendrix, I think he had to ask himself, like, what the hell am I doing here? Because he just couldn't imagine a guy like Hendrix just coming up with the sounds that he came up with. And Eric Clapton definitely saw that he was like the lesser of the two. Marshall did not stop innovating. In the 1970s, they introduced the Master Volume series, allowing players to get that sweet overdriven sound at lower volumes. In the 80s, they released the JCM 800, which is right here. This sweet baby of mine, I'm taking this to my grave. A high gain amp that became a favorite among metal and hard rock bands like Slayer, Metallica, and GNR. Now, the 90s brought the JCM 900 and the Valve State series, offering more versatility to match the changing music scene at the time. And today, Marshall amps are still evolving with digital modeling and compact designs while staying true to their classic tone. I gotta say though, those are cool and fun, but nothing beats the old tube amp JCM 800. I gotta give another hug. All right, so just to recap, Marshall amps are awesome. They have been a constant in the world of rock. Their unmistakable tone and their rugged design. Check out the ruggedness here. Look at that. Look at the texture on this thing. Man, it feels like a tank. It honestly does. And their iconic logo have made them a favorite for generations of musicians. But Marshall isn't just about amps. It's about a mindset, a commitment to pushing boundaries, being louder, and standing out. So if you really want to rock, there's no other way. Marshall is where it's at. So the next time you see a Marshall stack or hear that roaring, overdriven tone, remember the story of Jim Marshall, the legend, and the musicians who've inspired him. The Marshall amp, like I said, isn't just a piece of gear. It is really the sound of rock and roll, really. That's it. Nothing is better than a Marshall amp, and I'd say a Flying V, but a lot of people would say a Les Paul cranked up to the max. There's nothing that says rock and roll like that. You can go ask Slash yourself. Thanks for tuning in. Let me know what your favorite Marshall amp is, what year, what model, what color. I would be fascinated to know. So don't forget to keep it one louder and keep it loud. We'll see you in the next one.